Hey guys, what's up? Mad Season here, back with another video for you. With patch 8.0 on the horizon, with it comes the official end of the Legion expansion. If you want to say that it started with the 7.0 pre-patch, which was released on the 19th of July in 2016, we're about to hit the 2-year anniversary of Legion. We embarked upon the Broken Isles, lost allies, gained new ones, explored new dungeons, raids, and planets, and through the combined effort of 2 bitter enemies, we've defeated Sargeras' Burning Legion. So, in this one, let's take a look back at the expansion as a whole and choose the best and worst things about it. I'd say Legion overall has been pretty successful. A good recovery after the Warlords of Draenor, most would agree, I think. But it's not perfect by any means, so let's dive into it here. I'm a pretty optimistic person, so let's start with the best and work our way down from there. Before we start here though, I should say that it's all just opinion at the end of the day. I'm going to try my best to gauge the general thoughts on all of these features and place them appropriately in each category, either best, worst, or in between, but if you don't agree with it, that's fine. So, in no strict order here, one of the best features in Legion has to be Mythic Plus dungeons. For nearly a decade, ever since the end of the Burning Crusade, dungeons in the world of Warcraft have been pretty neglected. They just served as a stepping stone to get to that next level of PvE content, which is of course raiding, and were seen more as a chore by players. First, we level through questing, then we gear up through normal dungeons, then heroic, and then finally raiding. The forefront of endgame PvE will always be raiding, but through the Mythic Plus Keystone system, players now have the option of doing challenging endgame content in a smaller and more focused setting. If you want endgame gear, you no longer have to join 10 to 20 random strangers, set up raid times, and all of that stuff that goes with being in a raiding guild. Just grab 4 friends and pop in a keystone. Not only do the enemies within get more powerful the higher level keystone you put in, but they also gain special affixes and abilities rotated weekly to keep things interesting. And combining that with the fact that the actual dungeons you run are selected randomly keeps things from getting too stale and repetitive. It's a feature that's been received pretty well by most players, and it'll be returning in many expansions to come, I'm sure.
The Burning Legion has returned.
Another plus with Legion, in my opinion, would be the general story and leveling. The storytelling in the game has definitely come a long way. We're no longer just killing 10 boars or kobolds or whatever, and through the combination of quests, zones, and in-game cutscenes, you see the little world and scenario that they created for you, and you really feel like you're part of the story. The hunt for the Pillars of Creation, the Nightborn of Suramar and their story with the Legion and how they encountered them, chasing Gul'dan into the Nighthold, the reopening of the Tomb of Sargeras, and even visiting the home base of the Legion, Argus. Each one of these storylines is an adventure itself, and it really puts the RPG into MMORPG. I think a lot of us went through these quests, dungeons, and raids to see what would happen next, not solely for the loot. The story really started to pick up with the Wrath of the Lich King expansion, in my opinion, with Arthas Menethil and everything surrounding him. But expansion by expansion, they've been improving in the technical sense of better and more cutscenes, and the way that they integrate them with the actual gameplay, such as the Broken Shore scenario and its cutscene, for example. When I went through that for the first time, my jaw was on the floor, and that's something that's never happened to me with this game in the 13 plus years that I've been playing it. I was legitimately pissed and, embarrassingly enough, a little emotional, which is saying a lot for this monotone dude, by the way. The whole expansion has a theme of sacrifice. Sacrifice for the sake of others, sacrifice others for the sake of yourself, and the way that both factions go in and come out of Legion over the course of these 2 years made it feel like quite the journey. I won't say anything about the writing of previous expansions because that's really a subjective thing, but in the scope of these cutscenes with how big they are and how many there are, they really did a good job, I think, start to finish. I'm no prophet, but I really think that people will look back to Legion someday, like how they do with the Wrath or the Burning Crusade expansions, and note that the story was one of its better features.
For the Alliance.
Another best of, I'd say, is the general graphics of the expansion. Now, graphics aren't everything certainly, but it's still worthy of talking about, I think. I'm mainly saying this not just for the actual zones and whatnot, but also for all of the new animations and spell effects. The Broken Isles look great. Visually, each zone gives you something new to look at, and it seems like we have nearly every biome to explore. You got swampy areas, snowy areas, forests, plains, demon corrupted, nightmare corrupted, a giant city, and an alien planet. The real improvements, though, are with your character. Up until this point, we were using 12-year-old animations, most of which were in dire need of updates. The warrior's charge actually looks like a charge now. For Whirlwind, instead of awkwardly spinning in place like a dreidel with red swirlies, your character actually builds momentum and does a spinning attack that looks like, well, a whirlwind. When you're casting a fireball, your character glows and overflows with power, and so on. They're just nice to look at and listen to as well, since the actual sound effects also got updated. Some classes still need some love and are seeing updates in the battle for Azeroth, such as the idle animation for hunters, new warlock effects, and so on. But Legion was the start of all of this, and it made great strides in an area where the world of Warcraft has been behind on for quite some time. Another positive in my book would be world quests. Of course, another new feature with Legion, and they're basically the replacement of those old daily quest hubs that we used to have. Instead of having a handful of maybe 10-ish quests that you'd repeat over and over day after day, you now have hundreds and hundreds spread throughout 9 zones selected randomly. They vary in type. Some are PvP, some are crafting, others are gathering, dungeon quests, raid quests, pet battles, and you of course have the normal go here and kill X world quests as well. You do still repeat the same quests eventually. I think that's always going to be inevitable in an MMO, but the variety is so much better than the alternative that we used to have, and combined with the emissary quests, you have a good daily system to keep things fresh in that MMO setting, which is a tough thing. Raiding is of course a big part of any MMO, so how did Legion do? Overall, pretty good I think. It certainly wasn't perfect, with most people agreeing that the Tomb of Sargeras was the weaker raid. I've heard the term Tomb of Soakgears thrown around since he had so much of that mechanic it seemed. In my opinion, it was also too heavy on mechanics where if just one person messed up, the entire raid wipes, and that's coming from someone who stopped at Heroic. I can't imagine how bad Mythic mode was with that. And combine that with the fact that Mythic Kill Jaden was completely broken at release, made for a pretty rough raid overall. But outside of that, we had the Emerald Nightmare, which was a decent start, the Trial of Valor, which was an alright mini-raid that served as a bridge to Nighthold, which was great in my opinion. Tons of variety in that place, with Elisande being my personal favorite. And again, heavy on story throughout the whole raid, with you finally getting your revenge on Gul'dan, the reason why this expansion exists. And lastly, we of course had Antorus the Burning Throne, which is another great raid with good variety and a story worthy of the end of an expansion. Now, to say if an aspect of an expansion is good or not, you usually have to compare it with the previous one, which would of course be the Warlords of Draenor. Okay, before you jump on the crap on Draenor train, one of, if not the only strong point of that expansion was the raiding. The raids and the fights were spectacular, and each one had a unique challenge to overcome. The only problem was that there just wasn't enough of them with just 3 raids. You have High Mall, the Blackrock Foundry, and the Hellfire Citadel, with the latter people pointing out as being one of the best raids ever made to this date. So, it's a tough thing to compare to. Personally, I think in terms of quality and a fight-by-fight basis, Draenor may have actually edged out Legion, but Legion in my mind comes out on top due to having 2 more raids, and the story tied to the raids was much more interesting and compelling to me personally, but that's going to be a subjective thing, I guess. So overall, a pretty solid expansion in terms of rating, certainly enough to earn a passing grade with most people, I think. That's it for the highlights of Legion. Next, let's get into the stuff that really wasn't amazing or amazingly terrible. Stuff that lied in the neutral zone that left people saying meh. First, we have class halls. Now, I think if you took class halls by themselves, they actually would have been received pretty favorably. It's a nice main hub dedicated for your class. It has a unique campaign story that really fits your class's lore. I think they termed it class fantasy. And you can do these missions for extra rewards. Not required by any means, but definitely a nice bonus in terms of gold making or gathering artifact power. But one of the big reasons why they didn't take off in a huge way, I think, is because of the garrison system in Draenor. Once again, you have to compare stuff to the previous expansion, and the garrisons put such a bad taste in people's mouths that anything remotely resembling them also caught some of that hate. Order halls were much improved in the sense that the whole expansion didn't revolve around them. You didn't have access to basically everything you could think of, which was the case for garrisons. A personal mine, an herb garden, profession center, and even an auction house with the right building, and all of this was in your own phase. The only people wandering about in your garrison were NPCs, making it seem almost like a single-player game sometimes. The point is, they're much more toned down in Legion, just serving as a place to do your main story and your daily mission table stuff. And you also see other members of your class in the same order hall, so you're no longer locked away from the world by yourself, and it still feels like an actual MMO. But still, through all of this, that association with the garrison system even a little bit brings this feature from the best list to the neutral category, or even worse for some players. Personally, I can't justify it as the best or worst of the expansion. It's right in the middle for me. Next, we have artifact weapons. I think this is another one that lies right in the middle for most people. You've done away with your conventional weapons that you upgrade through each raid tier, and instead pick up the arms of some of Azeroth's most powerful weapons, the Ashbringer for the Paladin, Egwin's Old Staff, Alunith for Arcane Mages, and so on. These weapons come with a plethora of traits for you to unlock over the course of the expansion, and they grew more and more powerful over time as you fully unlocked their potential. To unlock these traits, you needed to gather a special resource called Artifact Power, which is basically fuel for your artifacts that you got from a variety of sources. World quests, dungeons, raiding, PvP, pretty much everything for the most part. The idea was great, but it did come with downsides to keep it from earning a spot in the best of category for most people. The obvious negative point here is that it was a very grindy system, with the amount of artifact power needed for each trade rising and rising until the billions, and even trillions. The rate at which you gain artifact power is of course increased through artifact knowledge, which changed a few times over the course of the expansion due to players getting fatigued from the endless grind. It started with just work orders, which took hours or days depending on your current artifact knowledge level. There existed a catch-up mechanic for players who started later, but it still took a considerable amount of time to catch up, which discouraged starting alternate characters. This was remedied partially later with account-wide books that caught you up nearly immediately, or at least within 5 levels of the highest level of your main. And then finally, it was changed to a server-wide system, and work orders were removed, finally solving that problem of latecomers forever catching up and people letting their alts collect dust. If you look at it as it is now, it could be a system that you could put in the best of category, I think, but for the sake of being fair, we need to look at these features throughout the expansion, beginning to end. Another downside you could say is the fact that we use the same weapon for the whole expansion. As I mentioned, the core of any MMO is raiding. Why? Well, because of the loot, of course. You want to raid, kill the bosses, and get those gear upgrades. With artifacts, you could get items called relics, which increase their eye level, but since there are 3 of them, they're a third as impactful as the old system, and it's just not the same as getting that new shiny weapon. The holy grail of loot is always the weapon. Armor and trinkets are fine and all, but the weapon is the biggest DPS or healing increase, and getting to see an actual new model is a memorable moment for many players that you only realized you missed once we got into Legion. In my opinion, honestly, I thought overall artifacts were good for the game. That's mainly because I don't mind grindy stuff. It's kind of what you do in MMOs in my mindset. But this video isn't about my opinion, it's about the general player's opinion, so I think the neutral spot is the best place for them, taking all of this stuff into consideration. Next up, we have the class changes. Legion has been one of, if not the biggest expansion in terms of changes to all of the specs. It's hard to put this in the best of or worst of category because it varies spec by spec, so we'll just put it in the neutral category here. In general, there was a lot of pruning. Abilities that were seen as tertiary were removed in the Legion pre-patch, greatly reducing the amount of spells for many classes. Some say they removed the clutter, and others say they pruned a bit too much and left some specs too simple. But pruning wasn't the whole story. Some specs got complete reworks, such as the Demonology Warlock and the Survival Hunter, for example. The main reason for this pruning is because of class homogenization, and as Blizzard termed it, class fantasy. At the start of World of Warcraft, every class was quite unique from each other. Certain classes had certain buffs, abilities, or mechanics that were unique to them. The warrior was the only class with an execute-like ability, Only paladins had this oh snap button where they could become basically immune to damage for 10 seconds. Only a few classes had interrupts, and so on. Over time, expansion by expansion, these unique traits and tools have been passed around to where every spec had everything. Everyone had a sprint, everyone had some sort of instant heal, execute, or whatever, and I like to make the comparison of those children's toys where you fit a certain shaped object through their matching holes. Eventually, all shapes and holes just became circles, to where it was at its peak in the Mists of Pandaria expansion, in my opinion. So, this pruning was implemented in an attempt to get control of this again, and bring the identity back to each spec. Some were received well, and others not so much. Like I said, it's a mixed bag, and I could go over each spec painstakingly one by one, but I mean, come on. Have you seen the length of this video? Let's try to keep things reasonable here, so just as a quick summary, for me personally, I think they did more good than harm. I've leveled and geared a ton of vaults this expansion, not because I got bored with any one class, but rather I'd play another one and get hooked on its playstyle enough to want to raid with them. I think neutral is still the best spot for this though. We went over the best, so let's get into the features that definitely could have turned out better. Let's continue to work our way down here, starting with the PvP. PvP finally received some attention in Legion after a long period of neglect. I was debating on leaving this one out because honestly, I'm not a PvPer. I haven't put a serious amount of time into PvP since the Cataclysm expansion, I want to say, but it did see some big changes, so it's still worth talking about, so I'll try my best here. The main changes are brawls, which are kind of wacky alternate rule sets for existing battlegrounds, such as having multiple flags to cap in the Warsong Gulch. But the bigger feature is the new honor system. You gain honor points by PvPing, you level up, and gain access to special talents only usable in PvP, whether it be PvP world quests, battlegrounds, arenas, or whatever. And once you reach the max, which is 50, if you wish, you can do something called prestiging, which resets your honor level back to 0, and in return, you get some cosmetic rewards such as mounts and whatnot. Well, that sounds good and all, so why is it in this category? For two main reasons, I guess. First is, gear doesn't really matter. For the sake of fairness or balance, all of your stats are scaled up or down to a certain level such that everyone is on an even playing field. This is fine and all, but it goes against one of the core strengths of an MMO. You get gear so you become more powerful. If the gear that you get from PvP doesn't help you in PvP, what's really the point of it? Also add to the fact that all gear you get is random. We used to be able to pick and choose our gear and have a goal to work towards, but now it's loot boxes or bust, essentially removing that goal and hoping for that RNG to work in your favor. So that leaves PvPing just for the sake of crushing your enemies, seeing them driven before you, and hearing the lamentation of the women. That's fine and all, but then you have the actual class balance, which is never perfect, but it's a bit wonky in Legion. A common complaint I see is that it's nearly impossible to kill anyone without cooldowns. Everyone hits like a wet noodle until you pop cooldowns and go Super Saiyan for 15 seconds and hope that you kill your target. This makes for a very dull and predictable experience where you feel like you're at the mercy of your own cooldowns. World PvP is also a mess. They tried to bring it back with world quests, but as soon as you have flying introduced, World PvP is the first casualty, and since PvP is balanced around those scaled down stats, the balance in World PvP is awful. Legendaries are active, and tanks and rogues reign supreme pretty much. Again, I'm not a PvPer, so I feel out of my element here, but this is what I feel like the general opinion is on PvP this expansion. You can tell that they tried with the new honor system and even releasing a new battleground called the Seething Shore, but the main issue here people point out is the PvP itself. By all means, if you actually PvP'd a bit, chime in the comments and share some insight.
Game. Blouses.
You got your legendary at least.
Oh, you got the shitty one.
Callie looked over and just did a
You got
thumbs
the
up.
same one.
Next, we have legendaries, and everyone who's played Legion knows exactly what's about to come. Now, the legendaries themselves are actually an interesting part of the game, I think. Out of many different activities in the game, from raiding to dungeons, to even collecting random treasures in the world, you have a very small chance to obtain this super powerful, unique item that not only has ridiculous stats, but also powerful affixes that can completely alter how your class plays. On paper, it sounds great, so what's the problem? Well, they had super powerful affixes that could completely alter how your class played. They were far too powerful to go with the RNG-laden system with which you obtained them. Going back to the beginning of the expansion, there was nothing more frustrating for players to play for a full month, waiting and waiting for that legendary drop, and you got the absorption necklace. Meanwhile, your guildmate had gotten the best 3 legendaries possible for his spec, and is now working on his off-spec. The proof is in the pudding here. It's a system that's been tweaked and changed 100 times since launch, either altering drop rates several times, adding new stats to defensive legendaries to bring them up to par with the offensive ones, or flat out introducing new methods of obtaining legendaries in an attempt to add some semblance of order and control to placate the pitchfork-wielding player base. Similar to artifacts, I'd say that at its current state with Awakening Essences and the craftable legendaries, it's actually not terrible. If it released like this, certainly they would have been received way better, but again, in this list, we have to take a look at these features throughout the course of the expansion, and not just their ideal state. And with these revamps to legendaries, it was too little too late for a lot of players. I mentioned earlier that Legion was the RNG expansion. Next up, we have Titan Forging. Titan Forging, if you don't know, is a feature that any gear piece you obtain has a chance to proc and roll a higher eye level, or sometimes even helpful secondary stats. The main issue here is that eye level chance. Trying not to get too technical, the range for Titan Forging is quite huge, and these items can roll anywhere from +5 eye levels to anything up to the current cap, which is eye level 985 for non-legendaries. So it could be +5, +15, +40, and so on. The way it works is, if it rolls +5 eye levels, it'll attempt another roll to bring it to +10, and again until either it fails or you reach the cap. So actually reaching that cap is of course insanely rare, but it is possible. So basically, this is yet another luck-based system on top of many other luck-based systems already in the game. Gone are the days of realistically getting that best-in-slot gear for your character, and once you get the base pieces, you're basically just hoping for it to drop again, this time with a decent Titan Forge roll. It makes it much more grindy in general. There's that word again. I must have said grindy and RNG/random 100 times in this video. Some people like that aspect about Legion, and some people hate it. I think more people dislike Titan Forging in particular. It's just something that I've noticed over the 2 years of my coverage of Legion. And even when asking the devs if it'll see a return in BFA, which it is by the way, people are like, ugh, really? I can see the positive in it. It makes it so no matter what you're doing, there's always a chance for that upgrade. It gives you that incentive to keep raiding, doing dungeons, and whatnot, which is a pro, but as I've explained, you do have that downside of it becoming very grindy, and because of that, a lot of people count it as a negative overall. So, World of Warcraft Legion. Quite the expansion. Lots of positives, a few negatives, and some in between. Overall, I thought Legion did very well, and I had just a blast with it. I hate to end it on a bad note here by going over the worst of it, in fact. Most of you guys who know me usually know that I like to focus on the good stuff, so this might be quite a different video for you. Just keep in mind that, hey, it is just a game, and it's all just opinions. Maybe you loved Legendaries and Titan Forging, and maybe you hated the story and the rating, and that's fine. The only thing I care about is if you found the video entertaining and that I accurately captured most people's feelings on the expansion without letting my bias get in the way too much. I did want to go over some honorable mentions before I sign off here though. Things not really big enough to talk a whole bunch about. First is the Mage Tower challenges. These I think were another huge positive with Legion. One of the reasons I said Mythic Pluses were great was because it brought a realistic endgame for people wanting a smaller scale experience, and these challenges took it a step further, and they give you a nice tough and solo challenge to complete. Sure, during the Entorus raid tier, they're not insanely hard, but when they were first released, they gave even the best of the best a run for their money in a tough but legitimate challenge that tested not only your DPS, tanking or healing, but also your awareness. I think many of us are hoping that we'll see something similar in future expansions to come. I also wanted to mention Demon Hunters. A new class is pretty substantial, but they're pretty standard for expansions I think. We either get a new race or a class, so it's not something totally unique to just Legion. I think they did a good job with Demon Hunters though. Just 2 specs, but they were done pretty well and they fit a certain playstyle. It also feels like they belong to the world, not just something tacked on for the sake of it. Although most of you need to work on your names. Just saying. And another honorable mention goes out to the secrets of Legion. This would be stuff like Kasumath the Hungering, the Riddler's Mindworm, and the Lucid Nightmare. Who doesn't like secrets? All 3 of these had a super hidden and intricate scavenger hunt tied around them that was only finished through the combined effort of thousands and thousands of people. Shoutouts to the secret hunting Discord. It makes the world seem that much bigger, promotes exploration, not just of this expansion, but of past expansions as well, and adds a bit of mystery to everything. And lastly here, I wanted to mention the general content flow and patch speed. Legion followed the 77 days model for the most part, where we got a new patch every 11 weeks. Once more, comparing this to Draenor, this was a huge improvement. Draenor had such long content droughts that it really slowed things down, having several months between patches, with the worst of it being 13 months between the end of Draenor and the beginning of Legion. That's insane, but with Legion, they changed their model a bit to make the minor patches more major, and the patch speed in general was greatly sped up, and our new inter-expansion downtime will be about 6 months it looks like if you count patch 8.0 as the start of BFA. We technically don't have a release date for that yet, but if it follows the scheme with Legion's pre-patch, it should be around early July, bringing it to just under 6 months after 7.3.5, which was Legion's final big patch. Alright, with that, I think I'll sign off here. Hopefully, I did the expansion justice. If you disagree with what was said here, feel free to let me know. Here's to a fun past 2 years in the Broken Isles and Argus, and here's to 2 more in Zandalar and Kultiras. I'll see you there. I hope you found the video interesting or entertaining. Like it if you liked it, and I'll see you in the next one. Peace.
Farewell for now, mortals. We hope you enjoyed today's video. See you again soon.